If it weren't for Elena's release on Global, I think a lot of players would be extremely excited to be pulling for Violet right now to pair with their Locke. However, a lot of players already have Locke and Elena and might not be able to find room for Violet. But she does look really good. Her kit is super interesting, and I love units with interesting kits. So I think it's worth taking a look to see if maybe you can fit her on your team. As always, we're going to go over the pros and cons, but if you want to skip around the video, feel free to use the chapters in the video bar. And before we start the video, consider subscribing to the channel if you're a fan of my content. It helps support me, and I really appreciate it. Okay, we've got a ton of good things going on with Violet's kit. We're going to start with the mobility. She's got a base of 4 move and 2 jump, which is pretty amazing, and she can add another jump from an active skill on her fencer sub job. However, mobility is a double-edged sword, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. She also has very high agility and attack stats. Her agility is actually tied for the 2nd highest in the game. It's tied with Gilgamesh, believe it or not. If you don't have him, you might not know that. She's also very easy to build for critical rate and also critical damage. She has a lot of crit and crit damage innately, but can also buff that with active skills and also some equipment that we're going to be getting. She has courage, of course. It's only 1 use though, so that's fine. And then she has this huge AoE attack that is an AP break and an AP restore. Now, of course, these only take effect if the attack is a critical hit, which, you know, you're going to make sure that it is if you're running Violet. This is going to pair really well with Locke and his AP Hunt ability. If you successively hit an enemy with this or multiple enemies with this, you could strip away all of their AP and basically end the fight right there. So it has the potential to be absolutely devastating. She also has a defense break and a paralysis status effect. Of course, the paralysis also has to crit because that's kind of just a theme of her kit. You're really going to want to be building for critical rate, even more than critical damage, just to make sure that all of these awesome side effects also are happening. Now, another thing to talk about is her counter, because it's really interesting. It's not affected by counter chance down because there's not a chance for it to occur. It happens when you evade, yes or no. If you evade an attack, she's going to counter attack. And not only will she counter attack, but she's going to get slash resistance penetration on that counter attack. So it's actually pretty potent. However, she doesn't have any slash resistance penetration on the rest of her kit, so it's kind of a bummer unless you can get this going. Now, Violet does have a few cons as well. Her modifiers are pretty low, but this is pretty typical at this point for critical units. They don't seem to give them high modifiers. So obviously the crit damage is going to be really helpful because she's going to crit all the time and you can build it so high, but they kind of compensate for that by giving her lower modifiers, which is kind of a bummer when you think about it, but she's still going to be really powerful is basically what I'm saying. Now, she's very fragile to 100% hit attacks, and she can actually use active buffs to give herself both AoE and single target resistance, but it's hard to get it all applied to her considering that she has a wealth of buffs, and her mobility and her agility are so high, so she's going to be able to access the enemy very, very quickly. Her missile resist is also low compared to Elena and Locke, and that might also affect her survivability in terms of 100% hit attacks. Now, like I said, her slash resist penetration is only on her counter, so you're really going to want to have that Scions or whatever the VC is, the Final Fantasy 14 VC with slash resist penetration is going to be super important for Violet, so hopefully you pulled for it. Her kit does require a ton of decision making. Like I said, she has a wealth of buffs. Now, with the Fencer sub job and her own main job, there's a lot of overlap. So you're gonna have to turn a lot of abilities on or off and decide which direction you wanna go, because you can basically build her to do crit rate, crit damage. You could build her to be applying some single target AoE, and you also want her to be using one of 2 different evasion buffs. I understand that not every player is looking for a unit that needs that much fine-tuning, so that's why it's in the con section, because yes, that's not really a problem for a player that is going to spend the time getting her to work, but for a lot of players that, you know, want to play this game casually, then this is kind of a headache. For the comparisons on this video, we're going to talk about Elena and Locke, of course. So I'll put those up on the screen now, and you can see all of their stats compared to each other. Now, I'm also going to mention that they all have very similar evasion statistics. So Violet and Locke both get 17 passive evasion if you equip their passives, and Elena gets 15 passive evasion. They all have 25% evasion buffs on their kits, so they can match each other in that sense. But when we actually look at Violet, she's got more luck and agility than the other two, so she's basically going to be the more evasive in most scenarios, unless you're building her in a way that she's not using her evasion buff, or you're switching up her passives or something. She's going to be more evasive than both Elena and Locke, and that's certainly pretty appetizing. She's going to work really well with Locke because he can actually break slash resistance, and she doesn't have any penetration aside from her counter. She's also going to work really well with Locke, or pair really well with Elena because of all these chaining options she has. She has a 3-hit attack on her kit, a 2-hit attack on her kit, and a 3-hit LB. So if you match those up with Elena, you can get to 5 or 6 chain attacks really quickly. You can do some serious damage and maybe enable Locke for a super big hit. You can also enable some pretty crazy crit bonuses if you put her in a crit party. She has for herself the ability to restore AP on crits, but she can also apply a buff to her teammates that allow them to restore CT every time they crit. Now, you can imagine in a Locke and Elena party, if they were critting and restoring their own CT and then going faster and chaining more, you could really get out of hand. Thankfully, Locke and Elena aren't nearly as close to being built for crit naturally as Violet is, so you might actually run Violet with other crit units so that she can give them that skill. They can all be restoring their own CT, going faster and attacking again. I wanted to quickly mention that we're going to be able to farm a sword for Violet that gives crit rate up for 3 turns to start the battle, and this is opposed to Halloween Fred's sword that increases crit damage for 3 turns to start the battle. Both swords look really good. I'm kind of leaning towards Violet's sword just because so many of her skills are dependent on her actually critical hitting, so I think that would be really important for her to be doing that. So you'd want the crit hit rate up. Now, if she's already critting without the sword, then yeah, you're going to go for the crit damage because that's going to enable you to just deal some pretty insane damage. If you have crit rate up from something else like VCs or Espers and you're finding that you're really set, then you hopefully have farmed Halloween Fred's sword so that you have just an amazing amount of crit damage stacked. Alright, it's time to talk about whether or not you should pull, and this is a tough one because if you already have Elena and Locke, you can probably skip this banner. But if you only have one of the two, then Violet might be worth your time. However, it's hard to imagine that you don't already have Locke and Elena because Locke was free and Elena's come back multiple times lately, and if you really wanted to build on your light team, then you probably grabbed her. Now, if you didn't, then Violet is definitely somebody that you should be pairing with Locke, and you should definitely pull for her because I do think that she's quite good. I just think that if you have a lot of light units already, you can't possibly fit them all into one team, and it's going to be tricky to run all 3 together. I feel that in a guild battle context, they would lose a lot of steam after the first fight just because they might run out of their courage or re-raise. Now, if you're coming up against someone with AoE 100% hits, then you could really be in a lot of trouble. So if you come up against Terra and she's able to melt down all 3 of them, that can be a match-ending scenario there too. So having a tank is going to be very useful, or maybe Yuna instead. But at the end of the day, it's going to be your own decision on what you want to do with your account. So let me know what you think. Are you going to be pulling for Violet? Do you think she's worth going for if you already have Elena and Locke? Let me know in the comments. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. And I just want to say thank you for watching the video and supporting my content. I'm going to see you all in the next one.